In front of a crowd, police officers knocked Chuck Norris face down onto the asphalt. They laughed, thinking they had complete control over the situation, but in a few seconds everything changed. What Chuck did shocked not only the officers, but also all the witnesses around him. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you are watching this video from. The highway stretched endlessly beneath the rising sun, and the old pickup truck rolled steadily down the asphalt with the steady hum of an engine that had seen decades of service. Behind the wheel sat a man whose name the world knew, though here, in this quiet corner of America, he passed as just another traveler on his way through. Chuck Norris drove with the calm assurance of someone who had long ago stopped needing to prove himself to anyone. His eyes, steady and focused, scanned the road ahead. He was dressed simply: faded jeans, a buttoned shirt that had softened with years of wear, boots that bore the dust of countless places. To anyone passing by, he looked like an aging rancher, a man who belonged to the earth in the rhythm of small towns. He entered the outskirts of the community just as the morning took hold in earnest. White fences framed neat yards, and the houses glowed with the pride of ownership. Children pedaled their bikes toward school buses waiting at the corners, their laughter mixing with the rustle of leaves in the breeze. American flags hung neatly from porches, the fabric stirred gently by the air. Minivans backed out of driveways, their drivers soccer moms with steaming coffee cups headed toward errands and morning routines. It was a portrait of calm, of safety, the kind of town where the pace of life seemed measured and predictable. Chuck liked towns like this. He had driven across America many times in his life, sometimes for work, sometimes for training, sometimes for no reason other than the urge to move. And he found himself always drawn to places where people waved at strangers and smiled without suspicion. The world had changed since his youth, changed more than most cared to admit. But here, behind white fences and wide lawns, there was still a sense of old-fashioned decency. At least that's how it looked from the outside. He knew better than most that appearances could be deceiving. His thoughts wandered as the truck rumbled down the road. He remembered the long years in the Air Force, the endless hours of training, the competitions that pushed him to the top of the martial arts world. He thought of the movie sets where he had battled villains on screen, though he had always reminded himself that real life was far more demanding and far less forgiving. Yet none of those victories, neither on the mats nor in front of cameras, meant as much to him as the years he had spent teaching discipline, self-respect, and responsibility to young people who needed guidance. Fame had been a chapter in his life, but teaching, that was a purpose. That was why he was here, on this road, headed for a modest community center in this quiet town. He had been invited to lead a seminar on self-defense for teenagers and veterans. The invitation had appealed to him not because of the recognition, but because of the need. Veterans who had given years of their lives to service often returned to civilian life carrying burdens invisible to those around them. Teenagers, meanwhile, faced a world full of temptations, violence, and the constant pressure to prove themselves. Chuck knew both groups intimately. He had walked the path of service, and he had been the young man searching for discipline and direction. What better way to spend a few days than to bring those groups together and teach them not just how to fight, but why fighting should always be the last resort? The gas needle on the truck dipped low, pulling him out of his thoughts. He guided the vehicle off the road and into a Chevron station that sat on the corner opposite a wide brick police station with manicured landscaping. The station looked freshly polished, its flags crisp, its windows shining. Across the street, the gas station was alive with morning activity. Work trucks filled their tanks. Soccer moms idled in SUVs while chatting out their windows. A businessman in a wrinkled shirt darted inside for coffee and a breakfast sandwich. Everything about the scene felt ordinary, harmless, even pleasant. Chuck parked his truck by a pump and stepped out. He stretched slightly, loosening the stiffness that came with long hours behind the wheel. His movements were unhurried, the kind of careful ease that revealed strength held in reserve. To the people around him, he was just another customer. They saw an older man with lines around his eyes, hair silvered with age, moving with a relaxed confidence. None of them recognized the man who had once been the heavyweight champion of karate, the actor who had filled theaters with tales of heroes defeating evil, The martial artist whose name had become a symbol of resilience and discipline. Here he was invisible, and that suited him fine. He set the nozzle into the tank and leaned slightly against the truck while the fuel flowed. His gaze drifted across the lot, observing the casual patterns of people's lives. A young mother ushered her children toward a minivan, balancing a paper bag in one hand and gently steering her toddler with the other. An elderly man in a cardigan sat on a bench with a newspaper folded on his lap, glancing up occasionally at the passing cars. The air smelled faintly of gasoline and brewed coffee, sounds of traffic mingling with the chirps of birds from the trees at the lot's edge. Chuck allowed himself a small smile. For him, mornings like this were a reminder of why he still pushed forward, why he still trained, why he still taught. It wasn't about fighting anymore. It was about preserving moments like these. Ordinary lives carried on without fear, families able to laugh and talk and grow in safety. That was the essence of what martial arts had always been for him. Not violence, but the ability to protect peace. When the tank clicked full, he replaced the nozzle and tightened the cap. He wiped his hands on his jeans and glanced at his reflection in the truck's side mirror. The man staring back at him carried the history of decades in his features, but his eyes were steady, the same eyes that had stared down opponents and faced challenges countless times. Age had given him perspective, but not weakness. He headed toward the small convenience store to pay, his boots making soft taps on the concrete. Along the way, a man passing with a cup of coffee nodded politely. Chuck returned the gesture with an easy smile. A young woman balancing a child on her hip held the door open for him as he entered, and he thanked her warmly. Inside, the store smelled of fried food and fresh pastries. The clerk greeted him without a second glance, sliding his change across the counter after Chuck handed over a few bills. As he left, he could not help but notice the police station across the street once more. It stood as a symbol of order, of authority. Chuck respected the badge deeply. He had worked with countless law enforcement officers over the years, trained them, admired their dedication. But he also knew the truth that not all who wore the uniform lived up to its promise. Experience had taught him to never confuse appearance with reality. He returned to his truck, sipping his coffee slowly as he leaned against the side of the vehicle. Around him, life continued. People moved with their routines, and the morning sun climbed higher into the sky. It was a simple, ordinary moment, and Chuck treasured it. He had no way of knowing that the peace of this quiet morning was about to fracture. Forces he could not yet see were already moving toward him, drawn not by his fame or his reputation, but by something far uglier, the impulse to dominate, to humiliate, to use power not for protection, but for control. But for now, the old martial artist breathed in the calm, unaware of how quickly it was about to be stolen. The morning sunlight gleamed brightly on the windshields of cars pulling in and out of the Chevron station, reflecting sharp rays that caught in the eyes of people bustling about their ordinary business. Chuck leaned casually against the side of his old pickup, sipping the hot coffee he had just purchased, content to enjoy a few moments of quiet before driving on to his next stop. He had no plans to rush. His seminar would begin later that afternoon, and there was more than enough time. He savored the warmth of the cup in his hands and the smell of roasted beans drifting upward into the air. The ordinary rhythm of the scene began to shift when the low growl of a police cruiser's engine rolled into the lot. The car turned off the main road and slowed as though stalking prey, rather than merely pulling in for fuel. It was not unusual to see officers around town, especially with the station just across the street. But the way the cruiser angled itself, cutting across two empty parking spots and settling with an exaggerated screech of brakes, sent a faint ripple through the onlookers. Heads turned instinctively. Some shrugged, others lingered, sensing something different in the manner of the approach. Two officers climbed out. The older of the two, his hair closely cropped and flecked with gray, carried himself with the swagger of someone long used to his authority being unquestioned. His belly pressed against the line of his belt, but his movements were infused with a restless arrogance, as though eager to remind everyone watching that he wore a badge. The younger officer, tall and leaner, shadowed him like a loyal apprentice, mirroring his mannerisms with a smirk that seemed permanently etched across his face. their laughter carried into the air as though they had just shared a private joke at someone else's expense. They noticed Chuck almost immediately. He stood near his truck, coffee in hand, his posture relaxed. To them, he looked like an aging man who didn't quite belong in their carefully controlled little town. His truck was dusty, his clothes practical but plain, his face marked by years of life on the road. They didn't see discipline or experience or the legendary figure known across the world. They saw a target and outsider, someone they could toy with to feed their own sense of dominance. "Hey, look at Grandpa over there," the older officer muttered, loud enough for his partner and the people nearby to hear. His tone dripped with condescension, the words sharpened into a hook designed to provoke laughter. The younger one chuckled obediently, shaking his head as though it were the funniest thing he had heard all week. Chuck lifted his eyes toward them, but did not react. His expression remained calm, unreadable. He had heard worse, endured far more in his life than the shallow mockery of men who mistook cruelty for strength. He returned his gaze to the coffee cup, taking another sip. That small act of composure only seemed to irritate the officers further. The older one adjusted his belt and swaggered closer, his boots crunching against the gravel. He let his eyes roam over the truck with exaggerated scrutiny, then fixed his stare on Chuck. "Nice truck," he said with mock admiration. "Didn't think folks like you could afford one. You borrow it off somebody?" His voice carried easily through the still morning air, drawing the attention of customers who were already curious. Chuck remained silent. The lesson of discipline was one he had lived by for decades. Never rise to provocation without cause. He took another calm sip, his body language giving no satisfaction to the man baiting him. The younger officer grinned and moved to the other side of the truck, circling like a wolf testing its prey. He leaned in as if inspecting the tires, then straightened and called out, "Doesn't look registered here. Out of town, huh? Bet you're just passing through." He let the pause hang heavy, then added in a tone dripping with insinuation, "Somebody like you doesn't really belong in a place like this." The words drew murmurs from a few onlookers. A contractor filling his truck shook his head slightly and returned his eyes to the pump, but his hand hesitated. Two women chatting near their SUVs fell silent, watching now with unease. The ordinary rhythm of the gas station was broken, replaced with a sense of something sour threading through the air. Chuck lowered the cup from his lips and finally met the older officer's stare. His expression was measured, almost gentle, but behind his eyes was the steel of a man who had weathered storms far greater than these two men could ever imagine. "Is there something you need, officer?" he asked evenly. His voice carried no fear, no defensiveness, only calm clarity. The older man smirked, pleased that he had finally drawn a response. He stepped closer, deliberately invading Chuck's space, the scent of his aftershave mingling with the lingering odor of gasoline in the air. "Yeah, I need to know what you're doing here. Folks don't just roll into our town driving an old heap like this unless they're up to something." He tapped the side of the truck with two fingers, as though claiming some right to examine it. The younger officer laughed again, his amusement exaggerated, his body language echoing every gesture of his partner. The dynamic was clear. One led with aggression, the other followed with sycophantic delight. Together they believed they formed an unshakable wall of authority. Chuck's silence in the face of their growing hostility unsettled them. His refusal to cower, to lash out, to play their game, left them searching for new ways to needle him. The older officer jabbed a thumb toward the coffee cup. "Pretty fancy drink for someone just passing through. You sure you paid for that?" The accusation, absurd as it was, drew a ripple of discomfort among the witnesses. A teenage boy lingering by the convenience store door pulled out his phone and began recording. Others shifted uneasily, sensing that what had begun as mere mockery was turning into something heavier, something that would not end with a few harsh words. Chuck's expression didn't change. He could feel the eyes of the crowd, the tension growing like a storm cloud, but he would not be the one to let it break. Inside, he measured his breath, steady and controlled, the same way he had done in countless tournaments, countless real-world confrontations. He reminded himself of the principle that had guided him all his life. Never strike first, never escalate without need. The older officer, emboldened by the silence, leaned in closer, so near that the brim of his hat nearly brushed Chuck's forehead. "What are you hiding, old man?" he said with mock menace. "People like you don't come through here without a reason. And I don't like reasons I don't know." Chuck set his coffee cup on the hood of his truck, his movements calm and deliberate, not hurried or defensive. He straightened to his full height, meeting the officer's stare head-on. Though his frame was lean with age, his presence filled the space, his eyes carrying the weight of years of discipline and unshakable strength. The younger officer shifted uneasily, a flicker of doubt passing across his face. For the first time, he seemed to sense that the man they were circling was not quite the helpless target they had assumed. But pride and the fear of looking weak in front of his partner kept him from stepping back. He forced another smirk, raising his voice for the crowd. "You gonna answer him, or what? Cat got your tongue?" The murmurs grew louder. A mother tugged her child closer, muttering under her breath about the officers going too far. The elderly man on the bench folded his newspaper tightly in his hands, his knuckles white. Everyone could feel it now, the tension winding tighter and tighter, though no one dared intervene. Chuck remained composed. He had seen this before. The slow buildup of men intoxicated by power, the thrill they derived from belittling others. He knew exactly where it was headed if left unchecked. But still he waited, not out of fear, but out of discipline, because patience was the mark of true strength. The older officer's lips curled into something halfway between a grin and a snarl. "Don't worry," he said, his voice low but loud enough for the crowd to hear. "We'll find out what you're hiding, one way or another." And with those words, the ordinary morning at the gas station tipped fully into something darker. Chuck could feel the balance shifting, the provocation crossing the line from words into the beginnings of something more physical. Around him, the witnesses leaned forward, phones raised, breaths held. The officers thought they were tightening a trap, but in truth, they were only digging deeper into a pit of their own making. The stage was set. What had begun with laughter and insults was sliding, step by inevitable step, toward confrontation. And Chuck, calm and unshaken, stood at the center, the eye of the storm, waiting to see how far these men would dare to go. The words hung in the air like a poisonous mist, and for a long moment nothing moved except the drifting breeze that rattled a discarded receipt across the asphalt. Chuck stood motionless beside his truck, his hands calm at his sides, his coffee cup resting neatly on the hood where he had placed it. The crowd that had gathered in hesitant curiosity now felt the sting of unease. What had begun as a casual spectacle, a couple of officers taunting a stranger, was taking on a darker edge. Conversations had stopped. Laughter had died. Even the hum of idling engines seemed quieter, as people strained to hear every word. The older officer, feeding on the silence like a predator savoring the stillness before a kill, stepped closer and jabbed a finger against Chuck's chest. The gesture was sharp, invasive, designed to elicit a reaction. Chuck did not flinch. His expression remained steady, his eyes calm, but that very composure only fueled the officer's need to break him down. He pressed harder, sneering as if each second of restraint was some kind of insult to his authority. "You think you're tough, standing there like you're better than everyone else?" the officer hissed. His partner laughed loudly, the sound carrying across the lot, false bravado meant to bolster his superior. "Come on, old man, show us those reflexes you're hiding. Or can't you anymore?" Chuck let the insults wash over him. Inside, he measured his breathing the way he had always done when facing aggression, steadying his heart, quieting the impulse to react. His whole life had been built on the principle that the first strike of anger was the first loss of discipline. Yet he could feel the rope stretching thinner with every shove, every taunt. The older officer's shove turned suddenly into something more forceful. He grabbed Chuck's arm, twisting it up behind his back in a maneuver meant not just to control, but to humiliate. The younger one stepped forward eagerly, pressing a hand against Chuck's shoulder and shoving him toward the truck. Gasps rose from the bystanders. Phones were raised higher, their cameras catching every angle. The elderly man on the bench muttered something under his breath and shook his head with disgust. A woman near the pumps clutched her child's hand tighter, whispering for her to look away. Chuck's body hit the side of his truck with a dull thud, his face pressed toward the cool metal. The hand on his arm tightened painfully, pushing his shoulder into a strained angle. The younger officer leaned closer, his breath hot with the smell of coffee and arrogance. "How's that feel, huh? Not so quiet now, are you?" The older officer pulled him back from the truck and forced him downward. Gravel scraped beneath Chuck's boots as his knees hit the pavement. His palms pressed against the ground, and then a knee drove into his back, pushing him lower still. His cheek met the rough asphalt. He felt the burn of grit digging into his skin, the faint sting of small cuts beginning to form. Around him, voices rose in alarm. "Hey, he didn't do anything!" A woman shouted from near the entrance to the convenience store. "This is wrong!" cried another, her voice trembling with outrage. But the officers ignored them. They were beyond hearing now, drunk on the spectacle, performing not only for themselves, but for the crowd they believed they controlled. The younger one glanced at the raised phones and smirked, as if this humiliation were some kind of victory to be preserved on record. Chuck remained still, his cheek pressed against the ground, his breath slow and measured. Inside, a storm churned. He remembered every lesson he had taught to students over the years about control, about restraint, about the line that separates strength from violence. He had preached that patience was not weakness, that humility was not surrender. But he also knew that there came a point when patience became complicity, when restraint became submission to injustice. The older officer pressed harder on his back, his voice carrying across the lot. "See this, people? This is what happens when you don't respect the badge. This is what happens when you don't answer questions. We don't tolerate attitude here." The words were meant to resonate, to assert dominance not just over Chuck, but over everyone watching. But the effect was the opposite. Murmurs of disapproval rippled through the crowd. Several witnesses shouted in protest. The teenager by the store door spoke loudly for his recording, his voice cracking with indignation. "He didn't do anything. They're just messing with him because they can." Chuck's face pressed against the hot ground, the sun heating the asphalt beneath him. He felt the scrape of gravel against his skin, the sharp sting of a cut blooming on his cheekbone. His breathing remained controlled, though it grew heavier with the weight pinning him down. Every nerve in his body urged him to act, to release the power coiled inside him, but he held still, waiting, calculating, measuring. The younger officer crouched beside him, mocking his calmness. "Not so quiet now, huh? Where's that big talk? Or are you just gonna stay down there like the old man you are?" He chuckled darkly, glancing up at the crowd as though expecting applause. But no applause came. Only more phones raised higher, more voices growing louder with outrage. Chuck's eyes, pressed against the pavement, shifted just enough to catch sight of a child peering around her mother's leg. Her wide eyes were filled with fear, confusion. He felt the sting of humiliation, not for himself, but for the message being sent that this was what power looked like, that this was how authority behaved. It went against everything he had ever stood for, everything he had ever taught. The older officer leaned down close, his voice a harsh whisper meant only for Chuck. "You're nothing here. Nothing. Just another nobody we can put in his place." His knee ground harder into Chuck's back, pressing the air from his lungs. And for the first time that morning, Chuck's jaw tightened. His breath, though still steady, grew sharper. In his chest, discipline warred with resolve. He knew where this was headed. He knew the crowd was watching, recording, remembering. He knew that patience had reached its limit, that the line had been crossed. But still, for the moment, he endured. He let the humiliation burn into his skin, into his pride, into his memory. Because when he chose to act, it would not be out of anger. It would be deliberate, precise, unarguable. It would be a lesson, not just for the two men who thought they held power, but for everyone watching. The crowd grew restless. Voices rose louder, firmer, more insistent. "Let him go!" someone shouted. "He hasn't done anything!" Others joined in, their protests echoing against the walls of the gas station and across the manicured lawn of the police station opposite. The officers, blinded by their own pride, ignored it all. Chuck's cheek pressed deeper into the asphalt, the scrape of stone cutting sharper against his skin. His hands, restrained and pinned, curled slightly into fists. His mind was a steel trap, each thought precise, each decision measured. He would act. Not yet, but soon. The older officer pressed his weight down once more, driving the point home. "Stay down, old man. Stay down where you belong." And with those words, the spectacle of mockery and arrogance reached its peak. The onlookers gasped, their outrage mounting. Phones recorded every second, preserving not just the aggression but the humiliation. Chuck's patience, though vast, was nearing its end. The discipline that had guided him for decades was no shield against injustice that had become open cruelty. He knew what was coming, and deep within him, a quiet decision had already been made. The storm had not yet broken, but the first lightning was already in the air. The hot pavement pressed against Chuck's cheek, the sting of fresh scrapes burning with every shallow breath forced from his lungs by the weight on his back. The knee digging into his spine was merciless, a crude demonstration of power that had nothing to do with justice. Around him, the air was charged with the voices of witnesses, some shouting in protest, some recording in silence, all swept into the tide of a spectacle that had begun as a petty provocation and now swelled into something darker. The officers seemed blind to the disapproval, deaf to the outrage, convinced that their authority was enough to drown out truth itself. Chuck's mind, however, was as clear as ever. Years of training had forged within him a discipline that could withstand humiliation, pain, even injustice. Yet as he lay pressed against the asphalt, he understood with sharp clarity that he was standing at the threshold where patience ceases to be a virtue and begins to look like surrender. He thought of the young faces he would meet later that day at the community center. Teenagers coming to him for guidance, veterans hoping to regain some measure of strength and dignity. What lesson would he give them if he allowed this farce to continue unchallenged? That power always prevails, even when it is corrupt? That injustice must simply be endured? No, that was not the message his life had ever stood for. The older officer leaned lower, his lips close enough that Chuck could smell the stale coffee on his breath. "You don't get it, do you?" he murmured in a voice meant to humiliate. "This is my town, my rules. Men like you don't last long here." He pressed harder, grinding Chuck's face against the asphalt. The grit carved shallow cuts along his cheekbone, and a small smear of blood mixed with the dust. Chuck closed his eyes for a moment, not in defeat but in focus. His breathing slowed. He could hear the world around him with absolute clarity, the distant honk of a car horn on the main road, the frantic whisper of a mother pulling her child closer, the high-pitched beep of a fuel pump ending its cycle. Every sound sharpened, every detail etched into his awareness. His body was a coiled spring, but his mind was still a calm lake. He could act at any moment, with devastating precision. The only thing holding him back was choice. "Officer, please stop!" a woman's voice cried, quivering with indignation. "He hasn't done anything. You're hurting him." The younger officer turned his head and barked a laugh. "Ma'am, you don't know what you're talking about. This man's resisting. We're keeping the community safe." He knelt closer to Chuck and tapped the back of his head lightly with 2 fingers, mockingly. "See? He thinks he's better than us, but not today." Chuck's jaw tightened. He thought of his students again, of all the times he had explained that true strength lay not in striking, but in knowing when not to strike. But he also remembered his duty to stand against injustice. His parents had taught him long ago that character was measured not when life was easy, but when it was hardest. And what could be more difficult than enduring this, in silence, before so many eyes looking for an example? He shifted his gaze sideways, and in that narrow view, he saw a teenage boy holding up his phone, recording with both hands, his mouth slightly open in disbelief. The boy's eyes met his for a split second, wide and uncertain, and in them Chuck read the unspoken question. "Will you take this, or will you stand?" That look pierced deeper than the officer's knee could ever press. He could not allow that boy or anyone else here to walk away believing that cruelty and arrogance were invincible. The older officer mistook Chuck's silence for submission. "That's it," he said loudly, his voice carrying to the crowd. "See? He knows his place now. Just another nobody thinking he can mouth off to the badge. Well, lesson learned." He glanced at the bystanders as if expecting their approval, but all he received were mutters of disgust and the unwavering stares of cameras, capturing every word. Chuck drew in a slow, deliberate breath. His ribs protested under the weight, but the air filled his lungs with the certainty of decision. The edge of patience had been reached. He would not allow this theater of cruelty to continue 1 second longer. Still, he knew the action he would take must be measured, exact. It could not be an explosion of anger. It must be the lesson he intended it to be, a display of control, of strength without malice, of justice without vengeance. He began by speaking, his voice low but steady, carrying enough authority to pierce the noise. "You've made your point, officer." The words emerged with a calm that startled even the younger man, who frowned as though confused by Chuck's composure. "But you've gone too far." The older officer barked a laugh. "Too far? You don't get to tell me what's too far. You're lucky I don't haul you into the station right now." His knee pressed harder, testing for a flinch, for some sign of weakness. Chuck's lips curled into the faintest hint of a smile against the pavement. "No," he said quietly, but with iron beneath the word. "You're the one who's lucky. Lucky I've been patient." The crowd reacted with a collective murmur, the shift in tone unmistakable. The officers exchanged a glance, the younger one suddenly less sure, though pride kept him from stepping back. The older one shook his head, dismissing the words as bravado. "Big talk for a man face down on the ground." Sure. Chuck inhaled once more, steady and calm, centering himself in the ancient rhythm of discipline that had carried him through a lifetime of battles, both on and off the mat. He could feel the power coiled in every muscle, the years of training alive in his body, waiting for release. He did not tremble. He did not rage. He simply knew. The moment of choice had come. Above him, the sunlight reflected in the rows of windshields, dazzling bright. Around him, the witnesses waited in tense silence. Hearts pounding, phones steady. The air seemed to pause, the world holding its breath. Chuck Norris was done waiting. The line had been crossed. The edge of patience passed. What came next would not be an outburst of anger, but a master's lesson delivered with clarity. And as he prepared to move, to reclaim his dignity and reveal the truth of who he was, he felt a calm resolve settle over him like armor. He would not strike out of hatred, but out of justice. He would not humiliate, but he would make certain these men and everyone watching understood what true strength meant. In that instant, the storm inside him stilled. There was no rage, no chaos, only purpose. And when he acted, it would be swift, precise, and unforgettable. The world seemed to hold its breath. Chuck remained pressed against the asphalt, the weight on his back unrelenting, the sting of grit and blood raw against his cheek. The jeers of the officers had faded into the background, muffled by the drumbeat of his own pulse steadying into calm precision. He had reached the edge of patience, and now every muscle in his body, every instinct trained through decades of discipline, prepared to shift. The decision was made. He would not remain a victim of their arrogance. He would not allow the crowd, especially the younger eyes watching, to believe that injustice must be endured without answer. What he would do now would be measured, deliberate, but undeniable. The older officer pressed his knee harder, leaning closer to whisper words meant to grind Chuck further into the dirt. "You're finished, old man. You thought you could stand up to us? You'll crawl before this is over." His laughter was low, cruel, the smug confidence of someone convinced of his invincibility. The younger officer chuckled as if to echo his partner, though the sound lacked conviction, a nervous edge betraying doubt. Chuck could sense it, the slight tremor in the younger man's voice, the flicker of hesitation in his movements. It didn't matter. The time for restraint had passed. With a suddenness that shocked even the closest onlookers, Chuck moved. His body, though pinned, surged with controlled energy. He twisted his hips in a sharp motion, leveraging the pressure against him into momentum. The older officer's knee slipped from its perch as Chuck's shoulder rolled and freed his arm from the painful lock. In the same fluid motion, he swept his leg back, catching the man's balance and toppling him sideways onto the ground. Gasps erupted from the crowd as the scene shifted in the blink of an eye. The younger officer reacted instinctively, reaching for his weapon, But Chuck was faster. He rose in a coiled movement, years of martial mastery guiding him with the grace of muscle memory. His hand shot out, grasping the officer's wrist before the gun left its holster. A quick twist, firm but controlled, forced the younger man to drop to his knees with a pained cry, the firearm still secured in its holster. Chuck's other hand pressed against his shoulder, guiding him down to the asphalt without delivering so much as a bruise more than necessary. The older officer scrambled to his feet, rage and disbelief twisting his features. He charged forward recklessly, swinging a heavy fist meant to smash the calm composure from Chuck's face. But Chuck was already moving. He pivoted smoothly, sidestepping the wild blow, his foot sweeping behind the man's leg. With a deft shove of his palm, the officer stumbled forward, crashing to the ground once more. Chuck did not follow with violence. He simply stepped back, his stance balanced, his breathing even, every fiber of his being radiating control. The crowd was stunned into silence, then broke into a chorus of gasps and exclamations. Phones captured every moment, lenses fixed on the spectacle of a man who had, only seconds before, been humiliated on the ground, now standing tall, two trained officers helpless before him. A woman clutched her chest, whispering to the man beside her, "Did you see that? He moved like lightning." The teenager holding his phone grinned wide, his disbelief melting into awe. "Oh my God," he muttered for the recording. "This guy just flipped them like it was nothing." The younger officer, still pinned to the ground by the controlled pressure on his shoulder, tried to squirm free. Chuck's voice cut through his grunts, calm but firm. "Stop resisting. You're only making it worse for yourself." The officer froze at the command, unnerved by the tone. It wasn't anger. It wasn't mocking. It was authority, the kind that didn't need shouting or threats. The older officer staggered up once more, spitting dirt from his lips, his face flushed with fury. "You're done, you hear me? You're—" His words were cut off as he lunged again, and once again Chuck deflected with effortless precision. A step aside, a sharp movement of his forearm, and the officer found his own momentum working against him, sprawling forward with a grunt as he hit the ground hard. This time Chuck's boot pressed lightly against his wrist, pinning it without cruelty but with absolute control. The onlookers were no longer uncertain. Murmurs of support rose from the witnesses, their outrage transformed into cheers of encouragement. "Teach them a lesson," someone called. Another voice shouted, "That's what you get for messing with the wrong man." The atmosphere shifted as if a tide had turned. Where moments ago power had belonged entirely to the officers, it now radiated from the man they had sought to humiliate. Chuck looked down at the older officer, his eyes steady. "You abused the badge," he said quietly, though the words carried in the sudden hush that followed. "And you think that gives you power. But this—" He pressed just enough weight into the man's wrist to remind him of his helplessness. "This is what real control looks like." The younger officer groaned beneath Chuck's hold, his earlier bravado crumbling into fear. "What are you? Who are you?" he muttered, disbelief lacing his tone. Chuck didn't answer immediately. Instead, he released the pressure on his shoulder and stepped back, allowing the man to scramble clumsily to his feet. Both officers now stood at a distance, their faces pale, their confidence shattered. Chuck adjusted the cuff of his sleeve, his composure unbroken, his breathing steady. To the witnesses, it was as though the violence had never touched him. He looked every bit the master of his craft, the embodiment of calm strength. "You wanted to make a show," he said, his voice level. "You wanted to humiliate a man in front of these people. But the only lesson you've given is how arrogance destroys itself." The officers stood frozen, caught between the shame of retreat and the futility of further aggression. The crowd's eyes were on them, recording devices capturing their every twitch, every faltering breath. There was no path forward that didn't lead to deeper disgrace. Chuck turned his gaze to the bystanders, his eyes meeting theirs with the same calm authority. "You all saw what happened here," he said. "Remember it. Power without respect is nothing. Authority without honor is weakness." Applause erupted, spontaneous and genuine. The elderly man on the bench nodded with satisfaction. The mother who had shielded her child earlier now stood tall, her expression fierce with approval. Even the teenagers cheered, their phones shaking as they tried to capture the moment. Chuck did not smile, did not bask in the attention. His work was not for show. It was a lesson, delivered not in anger, but in the simple truth of his actions. The officers, once towering figures of intimidation, now looked small, diminished, their weapons holstered, but their authority shattered. They had sought to prove dominance, but they had only exposed their weakness. The storm had broken. The turn of power was complete. Chuck Norris stood tall, not as a man who had won a fight, but as a man who had shown that dignity, discipline, and justice will always outlast arrogance and cruelty. And as he looked once more into the faces of those watching, he knew the lesson had been received. The gas station lot was thick with tension, but it was no longer the suffocating tension of fear. The balance had shifted decisively. The crowd that had stood frozen in outrage now swelled with relief, even awe, at what they had just witnessed. Two uniformed officers, men who only minutes ago strutted with arrogance, were humbled and disarmed before their very eyes. At the center stood Chuck, tall and steady, his presence radiating calm authority. His shirt was wrinkled, his cheek bore the fresh cut from the pavement, but his bearing was unshaken. He looked not like a man who had been humiliated, but like a man who had chosen the moment to reveal what true power meant. The younger officer staggered backward, his face pale, one hand still clutching the wrist Chuck had twisted with merciless precision. He looked at his partner for support, but the older man remained pinned where he had fallen, breathing heavily, his eyes wide with disbelief and shame. The crowd murmured, recording every detail, their phones held aloft like witnesses sworn to preserve the truth. What had begun as a display of dominance had transformed into a public reckoning. Chuck stepped back from both men, adjusting the sleeve of his shirt with deliberate calm. His voice, when it came, was low and steady, carrying across the lot with the weight of finality. It doesn't take courage to push down someone who isn't fighting back. That's not strength. That's fear dressed in a uniform. The words landed like blows sharper than any strike could have been. A man in the crowd clapped once, firmly, and others joined in, the sound swelling into applause. A woman cheered, her voice strong with gratitude, and the teenager with the phone muttered excitedly into his recording, "He just taught them what respect really means." The energy shifted from outrage to vindication, the kind that could not be undone. The older officer tried to rise once more, pushing himself up on shaky arms, his pride demanding at least the appearance of control. "You think you've won something?" he growled, though the words quivered with the tremor of a man who knew his defeat was absolute. Chuck met his glare calmly, his expression almost sympathetic. "I didn't win anything," Chuck said simply. "This was never a fight. This was a lesson. For you, for everyone watching. A badge means nothing if the person wearing it doesn't understand respect." The silence that followed was heavy, not uncomfortable, but contemplative. The witnesses absorbed his words, their expressions shifting as if the morning's events were etching themselves permanently into memory. The officers, their arrogance stripped bare, seemed suddenly small against the man they had tried to belittle. Chuck bent slightly, retrieving his coffee cup from the hood of his truck. Miraculously, though a bit of the liquid had spilled, it was still mostly full. He took a calm sip, the action so ordinary it underscored the extraordinary nature of what had just occurred. The crowd erupted in laughter, not mocking but joyous, the release of tension spilling into applause once more. The older officer's shoulders sagged, his chest heaving. He no longer shouted. His words had failed him, his authority reduced to fragments. The younger one lowered his gaze, unable to meet the eyes of anyone present. The phones recorded their humiliation, the evidence of their abuse of power immortalized in digital clarity. There would be no rewriting what had happened, no false report strong enough to overwrite the truth witnessed by dozens. Chuck turned to the people gathered, his eyes scanning the crowd, pausing on the boy who had recorded so intently. "You keep filming," he said, his voice gentle but commanding. "Truth matters. When people forget that, the world changes for the worse. But when we stand together, when we remember that respect is earned, not demanded, things can change for the better." The boy nodded vigorously, his young face alight with admiration. A mother stepped forward, her child clutching her hand. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "They do this to people all the time. Nobody ever stops them." Chuck inclined his head respectfully. Everyone has the power to stop them, he replied. Sometimes it takes one person willing to stand. Sometimes it just takes people watching to say enough. But it always takes courage. The applause grew louder. The officers, overwhelmed and disgraced, slunk back toward their cruiser, their movements stripped of the swagger they had carried only minutes earlier. They did not try to reclaim authority. They did not dare. The eyes of the crowd and the quiet authority of the man who had bested them without hate had broken them more completely than any physical defeat could. Chuck returned to his truck, setting the coffee cup carefully inside. The cut on his cheek still stung, but he ignored it. Pain was temporary. The lesson was lasting. He paused, his hand resting lightly on the driver's side door, and turned once more to face the people who had gathered. You don't fight arrogance with anger, he said. You fight it with discipline. You don't answer cruelty with cruelty. You answer it with strength that doesn't need to shout. That's the difference between power and honor. The crowd fell into silence again, absorbing the weight of his words. Then, as though a signal had been given, they broke into applause that shook the air, louder than before, ringing across the lot and even toward the brick facade of the police station opposite. People cheered, clapped, raised their phones higher, capturing not just the aftermath, but the message. Chuck gave them one last nod and climbed into his truck. He turned the engine over, the old vehicle rumbling to life with its familiar growl. As he pulled out of the lot, the crowd parted respectfully, their eyes following him, their voices still carrying words of gratitude and admiration. Children waved. Teenagers shouted praise. Adults called out blessings. The officers remained by their cruiser, silent, their humiliation complete. The sun had risen higher now, casting golden light across the town. Chuck drove calmly, his mind already shifting toward the seminar he would lead. The events of the morning would follow him there, carried in whispers, in videos already being uploaded and shared. But more importantly, they would carry into the lives of those who had witnessed them. The message had been clear, not only for the officers, but for everyone. Strength without discipline is weakness, authority without respect is nothing, and patience is powerful only when guided by the courage to act when it matters most. Later that day, the community center overflowed with people. News of the incident had spread faster than fire in dry grass, and what was meant to be a modest gathering of students and veterans became a full hall brimming with anticipation. Chuck stood before them, his cheek still bearing the mark of the morning's humiliation, but his voice calm and unwavering. He spoke of discipline, of courage, of the importance of self-control. He spoke of the dangers of arrogance and the necessity of respect. And as he looked into the faces of young people eager to learn and veterans yearning to reclaim dignity, he saw the reflection of what had unfolded earlier at that gas station. That morning had been more than a confrontation. It had been a turning point, a reminder that even in small towns where injustice hides behind polished facades, truth can surface in the most unexpected of ways. Chuck had not set out to become a symbol, but symbols are often forged in moments when someone chooses to stand against what is wrong. When he finished speaking, the hall erupted into applause just as the crowd had at the Chevron station. Parents clapped with pride, veterans stood tall, and children cheered with the unfiltered joy of hope. Chuck allowed himself the smallest of smiles, not of vanity, but of quiet satisfaction. The lesson had been delivered. As the day drew to a close and the town settled into evening, the videos of the confrontation spread far beyond the borders of that community. Across screens in homes and offices, people watched as an aging man turned humiliation into justice, as arrogance was dismantled by discipline. The comments flooded in: admiration, outrage at the officers, gratitude for the reminder that strength and honor still mattered. Chuck Norris did not read the comments. He did not need to. He had seen the eyes of those who had been there, heard their voices, felt the shift in the air, when the tide of fear gave way to the clarity of truth. That was enough. As the night settled, he sat quietly in his modest room, the cut on his cheek cleaned, the memory of the day lingering like the echo of a storm. He knew this was not the last time he would encounter injustice. But he also knew that every time it appeared, he carried within him the same resolve, the same discipline, the same unshakable truth. That power without honor will always fall, and that true strength lies in the courage to stand. The lesson had been given. The town would not forget, neither would the officers. And the world, watching through the glow of countless screens, would carry the memory forward. For once again, Chuck Norris had shown not just what it meant to fight, but what it meant to be unbroken. If this story moved you, don't just scroll away. Hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss the next unbelievable story we bring to life. Want more? Watch the next video on your screen. Each one is more shocking than the last. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, share this video with your friends and family. Let's spread the truth together.